So I will just start with introducing myself before handing over to Gregor, who will give you an overview about our presentation. So my name is Niklas Weiss, and I am working for and doing a PhD at the Leipzig University.
I'm Gregor Behnke. I'm currently a assistant professor at the Institute for Logic, Language and Computation at the University of Amsterdam. But I recently joined the institute, so most of the work that we are presenting here was done while I was a postdoc at the University of Freiburg still. So then I would hand back over to Niklas for the first part of the talk.
Okay, wait, I'll just give a quick overview then. I will be starting with our presentation by talking about like the starting point that we had with our investigation going forward. Afterwards, I will be talking about the generation of two word embeddings, the databases that were used for those models that were created, the pre-processing steps. And after that, I will be handing over to Gregor, who will be talking about Word2Vec. Luckily, today we already got a nice introduction to Word2Vec. Gregor will provide another one, a really short one. And then he will be talking about the comparison of those two models that we created and the different angles that we took to compare those models. So then let me start. Okay. So let me start this slide from the bottom up. So court decisions are considered to be incomprehensible for laypersons. That is a problem for two reasons. So firstly, court decisions address the parties to a conflict in question, and those parties are usually not trained in law, but they should be able to understand the court decisions. And secondly, in a state that is governed by the rule of law, it is also really important for the public to be able to follow the court decisions in general. So why are court decisions difficult to understand for laypersons? That is mainly due to the use of technical legal language. And this diagnosis is nothing new. The legal language in general has been criticized for decades, and not only in Germany, but I would say probably in most countries, also in the US, as you can see in the reference that I put in here to the plain English movement that started in the US in the 60s. So why is legal language difficult to understand for laypersons? There are two reasons for that. The first is a syntactical reason, and that is that legal language makes use of long sentences, many relative clauses, and especially in Germany, really long compound nouns, so long words. And the second reason is a rather semantic one, and that is that legal terms that are used in legal language are often created by assigning new meaning to already existing words that are already used in the standard language. So by this, the legal language creates ambiguous words. And this diagnosis is already in part supported by evidence. If you look at the syntactic aspect of it, there have been studies that were done by legal linguistic scholars, and they were already computer aided, and they just checked that they can prove that sentences in court decisions are longer in average than you will find than the sentences that you will find in like standard German text. And they also prove that there are many relative clauses and and usually more relative clauses than you would find in texts that are like general German texts. So if you look at the semantics and the ambiguity, there is no real evidence for the impact of the ambiguous words for the problems of understanding legal language. It has always been considered to be rather self-explanatory, and we thought it might be an interesting investigation to see if we can prove that the use of ambiguous words in legal language exists, or that it is a thing that is special to legal language, and which words in legal language are. So we did this by creating and comparing two word-to-vec models. So let me continue by talking about the generation of those models. First, I will be talking about the databases. So we collected over 500,000 German court decisions. 1/4 of them were from federal courts, and 3/4 were from state courts. You can also see that most of those decisions are from civil and criminal courts, which are part of the ordentliche Gerichtsbarkeit in German. And you will see that we have about 160,000 decisions by administrative courts and about 50,000 decisions each by social courts, finance courts, and labor courts. And here you can see the different states and the amount of decisions that we have from those states. And you will see that even though North Rhine-Westphalia only represents about 22% of the general German population, it is responsible for 43% of the court decisions that we are using as a database here, which illustrates the different publication practices of the states that we have in Germany. So the standard model, our second model, is a selection of 60 million sentences that we took from the Leipzig Corpora collection. You'll find a link in the slide. And those 60 million sentences are in part, 30 million of them are text from news, and 30 million, the other half, are from randomly selected websites. So we chose this amount, the 60 million sentences, to match the size of the legal model. So let me talk about the pre-processing steps. Probably most of you are familiar with those. First, we split the court decisions, or the text of the court decisions that we use as a databases in individual sentences, and we use the tokenizer from the natural language toolkit for this job, which has a special tokenizer for the German language, which we had to add some like special legal abbreviations to. And in the second step, we split those sentences into words, and we once again used the tokenizer of the natural language toolkit, and we removed the stopped words. So yeah, you'll find not a long German word on this one. So yeah, the second step for us was to improve the quality of the model. We tried to increase the amount of data per word that we used. So we did this by lemmatization, which probably most of you are familiar with, and by the recursive division of compound nouns if they are not found in a dictionary, and if they don't occur at least 100 times in the decision text. And yeah, on this slide you will find the longest German word. Actually, it's the name of a law which is it's not in effect anymore. So I will be handing over to Gregor for the next one.
Yep. Right, so then Then what we did, based on the preprocessed data, was we created word-to-vec models. And let me just give a brief introduction into what these models are. So for handling in a computer, natural text is often quite cumbersome because characters and strings of characters are hard to handle with mathematical means. So what one does usually is to translate these words into so-called word vectors, where you assign each word a sequence, a vector of numbers that you then use as a representative of that word in order to perform your calculations. The core assumption that underlies this mapping from a word to such a vector is that words that are used in similar contexts have similar meaning, meaning that if we have two sentences and if we can replace a word with another one, and this modified sentence also occurs in our corpora fairly often, then these two words will have some type of similarity. So what one usually does in order to create these word vectors is to use a neural network that tries to predict a word given the context that it occurs in. So, and to have an example here is the sentence, the accused took the wallet and fled. And now what the neural network is given is the sequence of words. The accused took the missing wallet and fled, and then it should predict the missing word in there. One probable guess here would be a victim or victims. So if we've trained the neural network, which we can just do given the text corpora, we can use what's called latent representations. I mean, basically the middle layer of the neural network that we use as a word vector. If we select a neural network architecture with an appropriate number of neurons, in this case we used 300, so the vectors that we use have 300 entries per word. We can just use these vectors as representations of the words. Okay, so what we know is that two words that have a similar meaning will be assigned similar vectors in this word-to-vec model. So if I have words like victim and victims, they will have very similar word vectors because they have pretty much the same meaning. Now, what's similarity here? Well, similarity is defined mathematically as the cosine similarity between the vectors, which is basically just the dot product divided by the product of the length of these two vectors, which is basically, in the end, the angle between the two vectors, if you can imagine that in a 300-dimensional vector space. Now, this value can range from 1 to -1. It's the minimum and maximum value it can have. If the value is 1 for two vectors, it means that these two vectors are exactly identical, meaning the two words have exactly the same meaning. If it's -1, they have the exact opposite meaning. And if it's 0, it means just that the meaning of these words is completely unrelated. To give you an example, I have 3 pairs here. The first one is always the German word for thief, Dieb, and the second one are 3 different words. So if we look at the similarity between the word vectors of Dieb and Täter, so thief and perpetrator, which are somehow related, we get 0.55, which is a relatively high similarity. If we take thief and victim, Opfer, we get 0.38, which is less because a thief and a victim aren't that similar, but they still have a shared context because they occur in criminal cases and they are kind of related to each other. Where there's a thief, there is always a victim. And the last one is thief and hearing aid, so Dieb and Hörgerät, which are completely unrelated to each other. And this results in a similarity of -0.05, which is negligibly near to 0. Right. So what we've now done is we've trained actually word-to-vec models for both our corpora. So we get one word-to-vec model for the meaning of words in legal corpora, so, which consists of court decisions, and one set of word vectors for each word in the standard German corpora that we have. Since the words that occur in both corpora are different naturally. We have different amount of words for which we actually have word vectors. Note that it's not possible to train word vectors for should not train word vectors for every word you have in your corpora, but only for words that occur relatively often. General advice is the word should occur at least 3 times, preferably more often. It's also the reason why we use lemmatization in order to increase the relative frequency of words that have only grammatical differences. So for the standard model, we have about 800,000 words for which we have word vectors. For the legal model, about 350,000. And if we take the intersection of these two sets, there remain about 217,000 words for which we have word vectors in both models. And these are the only ones that we can have a look at, actually. Because for words that have a word vector in the legal model but don't in the standard language, we simply can't define any type of semantics for the standard language. We can just say, well, these words are probably exclusively used in legal text, which is also interesting by itself. Now, however, this is not a significant part of the actual words that are different types of words that occur in both texts. They still make up most of the corpora. So if we look only at these 217,000 words, they still make up 97% or 99.5% roughly of both of the corpora. So this is pretty much all of the text, with exception of a few rarely occurring technical terms. Okay. So now that we've talked about the how we get to the model, of course, have to talk about the analysis that we've done with the model. So the immediate problem here is that we have 2 word-to-vec models, which aren't related to each other. And this is highly problematic because the word vectors that we've trained in both of the models, so if we look at one word, for example, thief, which occurs in both models, then the word vectors for both of these words can be arbitrarily different in both models. And the reason for this is just that we haven't coordinated the training of both models with each other. So there's no reason for these words to be assigned similar vectors. They can be in arbitrarily different places, can have arbitrarily different values. So there is no real reason to compare, no real means for comparing them. This would also be the case if we just train 2 word-to-vec models on the same corpora. They can have arbitrarily different word vectors, because the only thing that the word-to-vec model actually guarantees is that the relative distance or relative positioning of the word vectors remains similar, not the absolute positioning of the words. So we have to find a way to compare these 2 models with uncomparable word vectors. So what we actually did was we were mostly looking at relative differences. So the difference or the similarity measures that I've just talked about between 2 words still hold meaning if we compare 2 models with each other. So if we have a word that we have 2 words that are similar in one model but dissimilar in the other one, that seems to be a difference, right? Or that indicates a difference. So what we're doing is basically we were always looking at the difference of these differences in similarity for 2 pairs of words. So the first thing that we were doing was actually looking at it in a word-centric way. So we looked at one individual word and then looked at the similarity of this word to all the other words in the corpora. We did this for both word-to-vec models, and then computed the relative difference between these similarities. So if I take thief, then I'm looking at, for example, thief and perpetrator in both models and computing the difference between the similarities. They should be relatively low if the words are similar, and will be higher if the words are dissimilar. And then we took the average over all the words in the corpora. And what's interesting here is that actually for most words, this average difference in distances, or the average difference in similarity is relatively small. So it's usually between 0.06 and 0.08, the high degree of being more to the 0.06 value. And there are only, of the 217,000 words, only 286 which have an average distance of more than 0.09. So these are the ones that tend to have higher difference between the model. And these are actually words that are particularly interesting or particularly special for judicial text in German, where it's like bezüglich, which is regarding in English, or betreffend, concerning, beziehungsweise, respectively, der Antragsteller, which is the formal name of an applicant in an administrative procedure, if I'm not mistaken, der Kläger, the plaintiff in civil procedures, or beklagen, which if I'm using it in standard German, means something like to lament, but if I'm using it in legal context, it actually means to sue someone or to be sued by someone. Right. The next one that we have had a look at is actually word pairs. So for this particular investigation, we actually looked at all pairs of words that occurred, so for all pairs of different words that we had. So 217,000 squared pairs in total. And we looked at just the difference in similarity between these two pairs. So this should give us an indication whether there are two words that are very similar in one corpora and dissimilar in the other one. And this would indicate to us that there's actually a difference in meaning between these two corpora. There's actually a very high cutoff. So there's a set of, I don't have the numbers here in the slides, but you can look it up if you're interested. There's a very low number of pairs that actually have a significant, relatively high difference, and a large number of pairs that have a very low difference. So it seems that most of the words, or most of the word pairs actually don't have that much of a difference, but there are a few exceptions, a few pairs that we can highlight. And with a few, I mean like something in the vicinity of 20 to 30,000, if I remember correctly. So it's still a lot. The things that I'm noting here on the slides are the pairs with the highest difference, which I also find, found interesting. So the highest differences actually stem from abbreviations. So there is a lot of abbreviations that are related in the judicial texts. So just judicial abbreviations for things like types of courts, for example, that are highly related in judicial text, but not related in standard German. If we take these out, the next highly related one is Vortrag versus Sachvortrag. The English correspondence would be talk. Vortrag is just a talk, and the Sachvortrag is basically a submission of fact in court. These are related, highly related in German, but not related in the judicial texts. Completely different things. Then there are the words angreifen and attackieren, which both basically means to attack in English, but there is a difference and high difference in meaning in the judicial texts again. But this difference in meaning is not present in standard German. Same for Unentschieden and Niederlage, which is tie and defeat. The reason here is actually that we have a lot of German news and websites often talk about football, and a tie and a defeat are relatively highly related in football terms, but not related in judicial terms at all. And then we have also technical particular words like oben, which is something like above or see above, and soeben, which is just now, which have a different meaning in judicial text again than in standard German. Okay, the third investigation that we've had a look at is a statistical investigation, which kind of was for us to prove that the data that we actually have is kind of sound. So what we expect is that if both models are identical, then the learning process will still have an error, and we would expect this error, because it's just the sum of a lot of small errors, would in the end be normally distributed. If we assume that the difference of the average difference of the similarity should also be normally distributed, and we can test this, for example, with Kolmogorov-Smirnov test, but we have too many samples for this test to be accurate. We have more than 200,000 samples. So the only thing that we can have a look at as a substitute here is the d-value, which is basically the internal scoring value of the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test, which the higher it is, less likely the sample is actually normally distributed. And we've seen that most of the words actually have a very low d-value. So most of them have a very high likelihood of being normally distributed. Giving the number here, so only 7,900 of the 200-something thousand words have a d-value of more than 0.02. Highest ones again are judicial terms, like on the defendant's side, an obligation, legal obligation, as shown in, or the plaintiff. Right. Right, and the last thing, and which I think is most important for practitioners actually, is that we have also had a look at a qualitative analysis of the data, because what we've done so far is just a quantitative analysis. We can just show from the data that we presume that there is a difference in meaning, but we can't explain the reason for this difference, because we only have the word vectors which show as well. There is a difference, there is a mathematical difference that I can tell you about, but I can't explain you what the actual difference in meaning is. So for that, we've looked at means of visualizing the word vectors and the meaning of these of words in both models. And what we came up is basically with the means of showing the meaning of words in both models. So we're taking one word or one pair of words and want to show you the meaning of this word or pair of words in both models in order to show you the difference between them. And in order to do this, we take the word or pair of words and gather a set of similar words using both models. We can just query the models for similar words, get a set of them, and then we map these words to word vectors, which are again highly high dimensional representations, but we can reduce the dimensionality via things like principal component analysis or the t-distributed stochastic neighborhood embedding, which allows us to show these in a 2D plane. It's just an approximation of the actual word vectors, but usually a very good approximation. And I just want to show two, which we found poignant examples. The first one is a word that we haven't yet talked about. Can you go to the next? Yeah. Which is the one shown here with a gray box behind it. It's the German word beibringen. The standard English translation would be to teach. But if we look at the English model, we can see, so these words, and it's just showing the embedding here. This would be the standard model. So words that are near to the one one with the black box beibringen would have a relatively similar meaning. So in the standard model in German, this actually has the same meaning. So things like to perfect, language, to learn, vocabulary, things like that have a similar meaning in standard language. But in the legal language, a beibringen actually has a completely different meaning, which is usually associated with, in English, it would be something to hand in a document for a court procedure, for example. That would be to beibringen. This actually is reflected here in the word vectors with words like to hand in, to request, to deliver to someone, which shows that this word actually has a difference in meaning between standard and legal language, which we can actually show here. And the second example is one pair of words that I've mentioned before, namely the angreifen and attackieren pair. So both of them pretty much mean attack, which you can also see in the. Can you go to the next one in the standard model? Right, they are both words, the black ones, are pretty much next to each other. They have pretty much the identical meaning of attacking, and the related words are things like attacking, attack, what we have, aggression, to hit someone, to push someone, to trample someone, things like that. But if we look at the judicial text, actually one of them, namely the angreifen word, has a different meaning. So attackieren still has this attacking meaning with things like hitting, being drunk, murdering, being killed as similar words. But angreifen has more of a meaning that is more of a procedural way of attacking. So if you angreifen, do angreifen with something, you attack it in a just procedural way, not in a corporal way. So just I don't know, like demonstrate against it. Most of these words are related to judicial terms, which is actually fairly interesting to see that we have this word, which we can show has different meaning in judicial text, and can actually show that there is a very important difference between how these two words are used in both languages. Okay, with this, we have concluded showing you the empirical evaluation. These are our email addresses if you want to stay in contact with us. And we are also currently preparing a website with all these results and a lot more plots for words, so that everyone who's interested in having a look at the meaning of these words and the difference in meaning can actually access it. Thank you very much. And if there are any questions, we both are happy to answer them.
It doesn't come as a surprise. I have one question and one remark. On the corpus, you said roughly 500,000 decisions. I assume you scraped the collections of state, like the state kind of things, or did you find the corpus that I'm unaware of? So, and will you, of course, make the collected corpus available, because it is quite tedious to scrape all that? I can say from personal experience, and I would very much like to. We mostly use the collections by the states. That's also the reason why there are so many from North Rhine-Westphalia. Yeah. But we also used how is it called, Gregor? Judicialis.
Judicialis, yes. So the state courts and federal courts only publish, so the official websites only published since 2010. There is one older website which is scrapable that contains a lot of this prior to 2010. In general, I'm always happy to share the data. The only issue is that we haven't yet cleared it from a copyright perspective. So if I'm not mistaken, the state court decisions should be publishable. But as I said, we haven't yet cleared this, because we would basically have a second copy of it. But we are always happy to share it for academic purposes if you just send us an email, of course.
It's a super complicated copyright issue, but I can assure you that at least one scholar is of the opinion that there is an exception for public works that applies here, and that everyone believes except for a couple of people who make money with it. My second point went to the NLTK tokenization thing. I was thinking you guys might want to have a look at it was called Empirist 2015. There was a competition for specific by people at the Technical University of Darmstadt. That is Professor Gurevich's research group, and they held a long competition for improving tokenizers for German. Now, last I knew about was 2015, but they typically, Irina has maintains these things pretty well. And I think the best performing one was one that had extensive rules around German things that maybe give you a push in doing that, because my suspicion would be that there is a fair amount of very weird things going on around abbreviations, weird word limits, weird ways of how the thing is structured. So I think probably you get even clearer signals when you figure out the tokenization.
Thanks. I've just Googled and found a link to the website. So yeah, thanks. And especially in court decisions, we always have weird things like indents and quotations in there. So, for example, we also have a huge amount of English in our corpus, just because German court decisions actually contain English texts, like patent courts usually contain them, and civil courts if they decide on contracts that are written in English, which. So you always have these kind of extra problems.
I guess another surprise from a person working on German data stuff. So I think, well, it's just a remark in the sense that, okay, you've done all the scraping apparently, and you've written scrapers. We've also written scrapers in the past. It appears like a lot of people have been doing that. I think we might want to think about coordinating these efforts. And one thing that I just want to put out there, and again, there's at least two scholars who have the opinion that there is no copyright problem here. But it would be interesting to think about if we just kind of orchestrate scrapers to just pull upon request, whether that's a problem, because it just gives you the data set for fair use. And if you orchestrate the scrapers such that they're readily available, we might avoid actually providing the collection, but we would make anyone capable of reasonable Python. Like, we will put them in the position to easily obtain the data. And I think that would be something that you could easily also do on GitHub and kind of check that all the upstream is still working and stuff. So I think this is an interesting infrastructure thing that one could do, because I think it's painful the way that we provide this data. So I'd like to build an interface on top of it to kind of just trick all of these people. So yeah, but cool that you did some of the scraping, and maybe also if we coordinate the data cleaning in the sense, because then you might get clearer stuff on the NLP side. We might get more references for the graph stuff that we're doing. So I think interesting work.
Sure, happy to collaborate on this. And I think it's actually helpful and very important to have a stable data set for this, because it's a lot of work that went into scraping all the websites.
Maybe a quick question from me. I'm not going to ask about the German side of things, surprise. But I was just wondering if you have a theory for what exactly this approach measures, in the sense that I think it boils down to how we interpret the information in the word vector. Because I think in the presentation you've used the word meaning, and I'm not a linguist, but I think there might be some linguists out there who would take offense at saying that word vectors actually capture meaning, at least in the semantic sense. And I think I'm not so concerned about the big debate in linguistics as much as I'm concerned about how do we interpret that in terms of legal scholarship, in the sense that so given that we know that there are some distance differences between how it's used in maybe ordinary German versus legal German, but what exactly do we make of that? Is it a difference in usage, a difference in co-occurrence, or what exactly can we make of it?
I would say today we already heard the term like shadow of meaning. Somebody described word vectors by that, and I think that might be a really good way to approach it. Yeah, you can see, for example, we had the example, I think, oben and soeben in our talk, which really shows that we are looking at court documents, which are text documents. So oben, above, is in a text document, it's just like really similar to soeben, which means something I said before. And since like the standard model does not only consist of like text documents, but also like I mean, it is text, but it's also usually describing things of the like outside world. So I would say that it's always necessary to do like a lot of qualitative analysis afterwards, especially the plotting really helps, I think. Rigo, you want to add something?
Yeah, so second example would be the two words for attacking. And there you actually see that it's what we're analyzing is mostly a version of co-occurrence. So you have one version of this attack. So the angreifen, which co-occurs in judicial texts only with basically procedural terms, and the attackieren, which co-occurs only with physical attacking terms, for which this difference isn't present in standard German. So this is what we can measure here. There is, of course, a lot of meaning and semantics that we can't measure. The standard example in German is the Bank example. So we have the word Bank in German can both mean park bank and the fiscal, the money bank. And there is no way for word2vec to differentiate between these two meanings. There are other types of NLP methods like BERT, for example, that can differentiate between them, but we haven't yet had a look into this. So that these type of models would have more or a different way of be able to differentiate more between the semantics of word, or between different semantics of the same word. So this is more sort of semantics in terms of co-occurrence in texts analysis.
Thank you. And I think just thinking out loud here, maybe one way to sort of test the robustness of this approach is to take word pairs that we believe are, at least as humans, we know are similar in meaning, and to check whether they are actually put further apart in the approach. So there might be some words that, although they mean the same thing, they are used differently in just different contexts. I don't know German enough to know whether these words exist, but if those are, there are those words you test it, might see whether this approach is maybe trying out some false positives or something.
Yeah, so we have
There's also
we created a model. We did basic with basic consistency checking. So, for example, the examples that I gave with thief and a victim, perpetrator, and so on, these are actually from the legal model. So these differences are what we would expect from our natural understanding of the language to actually occur in the model, and they actually occur.
Any more questions?
I can just remark to you that like you said that would linguists take offense at calling this semantics? Like, no, it's called distributional semantics. It's been around since the 50s. But like
We have an actual linguist in the audience.
I mean, I'm sure there are tons of linguists. Maybe some of them like ontology is very much, but like just that like it's word to vec is not like a new idea. The idea has been around since the 50s.